In the dim glow of a Manhattan street lamp, a man steps out of a black sedan, immaculate suit, cigarette balanced between his fingers, eyes calm yet calculating. To the casual observer, he looks like any other successful businessman from 1930s New York. But behind that controlled presence is a mind engineered for power, a strategist who reshaped the very architecture of American organized crime. That man is Charles "Lucky" Luciano. And before this documentary ends, the audience will step not just into his world, but into the psychology that made him both feared and revered. This introduction sets the stage for a figure whose name has become synonymous with the American Mafia. Lucky Luciano is often credited with dragging the underworld out of its medieval traditions and into a modern era of efficiency, profit, and structure. But this transformation didn't happen overnight. It emerged from a lifetime of trauma, ambition, betrayal, and vision. In this opening sequence, the viewer is invited to step through the fog of myth and legend and confront the human being behind the empire, the boy from Sicily who became the architect of America's criminal dynasty. As the camera sweeps across the skyline of early 20th century New York, we feel the tension of a city bursting with opportunity but choking in corruption. Immigrant families crowd into tenements, street gangs clash for dominance, and law enforcement struggles to contain the chaos. In this fractured environment, where survival requires both brutality and intelligence, young Salvatore Lucania begins writing his destiny long before the world knows his name. This introduction paints that world in cinematic detail, desperate, dangerous, and alive with possibility. A world where a hungry mind like Luciano's could either be crushed or sharpened into something extraordinary. The section also introduces the key emotional conflict of the documentary. Was Lucky Luciano a man who sought power because he was destined for greatness? Or was he merely a survivor shaped by the violence around him? This question becomes the heartbeat of the entire film. Every rise, every betrayal, every decision he makes echoes back to this idea. Was he born to rule, or did the world push him to become the kind of man who could? To explore this fully, the introduction leans into the duality of Luciano's nature. On the one hand, he was ruthless, willing to have men killed, willing to betray old traditions, willing to engineer structures that exploited entire communities. On the other hand, he possessed a rare intelligence, capable of understanding people at their core. He knew what they feared, what they craved, and how they could be controlled. Not through brute force alone, but through discipline, organization, and psychological mastery. As the narrator speaks, the visuals contrast two worlds: the opulence Luciano eventually enjoys, silk suits, nightlife, high rollers, and the brutal poverty he was born into. The camera zooms into his eyes, young and sharp, filled not with innocence but with calculation. Even as a child, Luciano learned early that respect was never given. It had to be built through fear, courage, and strategic alliances. These early experiences become the seeds of his empire. The documentary foreshadows how his friendships with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel will later form a triad of power unlike anything the American underworld had seen before. The introduction also plants the idea that Luciano's true genius wasn't violence, it was discipline. He approached crime like an engineer approaches a machine. Analyzed the flaws, redesigned the structure, optimized the system. He understood that crime would always exist, but its power was wasted by internal wars and outdated codes. Luciano looked at the chaos of the gangs and saw potential, raw material waiting to be molded into something bigger, something more profitable, something capable of outliving any single man. This documentary seeks to understand that mind, the mind that asked not "how do I survive today?" but "how do I create a system that survives forever?" As the introduction builds, the tone becomes darker. The viewer begins to understand that Luciano's brilliance was inseparable from his ruthlessness. Power to him was not an accessory, it was a responsibility. A right. A destiny. Every major transformation in his life, from the streets to the commission, was driven by this internal belief. And yet, the documentary promises not to glorify his crimes but to dissect them, peel away the myth, and reveal the psychology that turned a boy into a kingpin. By the end of the introduction, the viewer stands at a symbolic doorway. Behind it lies the golden age of the Mafia: gun smoke, political corruption, speakeasies, betrayals hidden behind handshakes, alliances sealed with blood. And at the center of it all stands Luciano, calm, calculated, watching the empire he will build before it even exists. This documentary is not just the story of how he rose or how he fell, it is the story of how he thought. With this final moment, the introduction closes on a quiet but powerful image. Luciano at a bar, lighting a cigarette, eyes reflecting 1,000 unspoken plans. The voiceover delivers the final line, posing the central question once again. Does a man shape his destiny or does destiny shape the man? And with that, the story truly begins. Before Lucky Luciano ever set foot on American soil, New York City was already a storm of noise, desperation, and violent ambition. The early 1900s were not the glamorous roaring 20s of jazz and nightclubs. They were a brutal era defined by overcrowded tenements, corrupt politicians, ethnic rivalries, and a criminal underworld that operated like a chaotic battlefield. In this world, power belonged not to the smartest man, but to the one willing to shed the most blood. The Mafia as we now imagine it, organized, structured, almost corporate, did not exist. Instead, the city was a mosaic of small gangs, each clinging to a few blocks of turf, each battling for scraps of influence. This was the world young Salvatore Lucania would inherit, a world begging for someone with vision to tame it. At the time, Italian, Irish, and Jewish immigrants poured into the city by the millions, escaping poverty, hunger, and political oppression in their homelands. But what they found was far from the American dream. Jobs were scarce, discrimination was rampant, and survival required more than hard work. It required cunning. Children as young as 8 worked in factories or shined shoes in the streets, while adults took whatever work they could find, often under bosses who exploited them mercilessly. For many families, crime wasn't a choice, it was the only reliable form of income. This created a perfect breeding ground for gangs, loose groups of boys who learned early that fighting, stealing, and intimidation were their only tools for survival. Lower Manhattan was the epicenter of this unrest. The 5 Points, Mulberry Bend, and Little Italy were neighborhoods carved out by violence. The air smelled of sweat, garbage, and coal smoke. Cramped apartments housed entire families in a single room, and the streets were alive with hustlers, pickpockets, and political fixers. Police presence was more symbolic than functional. Officers were often bribed, threatened, or overwhelmed. Tammany Hall, the political machine that controlled much of the city, used gangs as muscle during elections, rewarding them with protection and blind eyes. This corrupt network created an environment in which crime thrived, but discipline did not. The Mafia families themselves were not yet unified forces. In fact, they barely resembled the later 5 families. Instead, they were splintered Sicilian and Calabrian groups, each bringing the old world vendettas and traditions with them. These early mobsters observed the code of omerta, but they lacked any larger organizational strategy. Sicilian bosses fought Italian-American bosses. Rural traditions clashed with urban realities. Rivalries turned into assassinations, and alliances shifted like sand. Without a central authority, the Mafia was trapped in a cycle of constant retaliation, an endless loop of revenge killings that made making money almost impossible. Any business formed, extortion rings, gambling dens, smuggling networks, was fragile and short-lived, constantly disrupted by violence. This environment becomes even more chaotic when examining the gang landscape beyond the Italian world. Irish gangs like the Wyos and the Eastmans, and Jewish gangs led by figures like Monk Eastman, controlled different neighborhoods. These groups weren't just criminals, they were urban warlords. Their members were hardened by street fights, and their loyalty was secured through fear. They brandished lead pipes, brass knuckles, and knives before they ever touched a gun. The Italian gangs entering this ecosystem were the newest players in a game already dominated by seasoned predators. That meant the Italians had to fight twice as hard for every inch of respect and survival. Another defining element of this era was the absence of a central criminal vision. No one thought about long-term organization or collective profit. Gang leaders were too focused on defending their tiny piece of turf to consider broader alliances. Every man wanted to be his own boss, every neighborhood wanted its own ruler, and every insult demanded retaliation. This is what made the underworld incredibly violent but incredibly inefficient. It was an environment where the ambitious rose quickly, but the intelligent found themselves frustrated by the lack of structure. That frustration would later become the fuel for Luciano's reforms. Prohibition had not yet arrived, so the underworld relied on small-scale schemes, idling around saloons, stealing cargo from docks, operating backroom gambling parlors. The true explosion of criminal wealth was still a decade away, but the hunger for opportunity was already visible. Immigrant communities, desperate for footholds in America, created their own informal power structures. Street bosses emerged as protectors but also exploiters. Store owners paid protection money to avoid vandalism or violence. Dockworkers paid bribes to get shifts. Even children paid tribute to elder gang members to be left alone. Crime was woven into daily routine like a tax, and no one questioned its presence. In this landscape, Luciano's arrival in New York represented more than another immigrant family seeking a new life. It marked the arrival of a mind that could see patterns others missed. Where the average gangster saw chaos, Luciano would one day see opportunity. Where most mobsters focused only on their immediate rivalries, Luciano would identify the power of collaboration. But before any of that could happen, the city itself had to be understood as a crucible, a violent training ground that forced him and countless others to develop street instincts, alliances, and a hunger for dominance. By exploring this world before Luciano's rise, the documentary lays out the stage on which he would later perform his revolution. This section shows the audience that Luciano didn't invent crime. He reinvented it. He didn't create violence, he redirected it. He didn't emerge from nowhere, he emerged because the underworld was desperate for someone like him. The chaos of early 20th century New York wasn't just background noise, it was the raw material from which Luciano would forge discipline, hierarchy, and destiny. In the end, this section leaves viewers with a powerful understanding. Before Lucky Luciano reshaped the Mafia itself was barely recognizable. Disorder ruled the streets, alliances were fragile, and power meant nothing without blood to defend it. Into this world stepped a boy who would soon see what others couldn't, a future where crime was not a street fight but a system. And New York, unknowingly, was already preparing him for it. Salvatore Lucania entered the world on November 24, 1897, in Lercara, a rugged Sicilian town scarred by poverty and shaped by old-world codes of honor. Life in Sicily taught harsh lessons early. Respect was everything, pride could get a man killed, and silence was a shield as valuable as any weapon. Even as a child, Salvatore observed men settling disputes with knives or whispered threats, and he learned quickly that survival required not only toughness, but a keen understanding of people. His family was poor, like most in their village, and the dream of America glowed in their minds like a distant promise. When the Lucania family finally boarded a ship to the New World in 1907, young Salvatore wasn't just crossing an ocean, he was crossing into a destiny that would change the face of American crime. The journey to Ellis Island was no simple transition. Salvatore arrived in New York as a shy, small kid who spoke almost no English. But the Lower East Side was an unforgiving battlefield that offered no time for hesitation. The tenements of Manhattan were overcrowded and filthy. Narrow alleyways reeked of garbage, sweat, and desperation. Within days, Salvatore realized that the rules of Sicily carried over, only harder, sharper. In the New World, weakness was punished instantly. Immigrant kids from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe fought each other daily, forming makeshift gangs that protected their blocks the way wolves protect territory. For a young Sicilian boy, the message was clear: adapt, or be consumed. It didn't take long for Salvatore to understand that language barriers and poverty were obstacles he had to overcome quickly if he wanted to survive. While other immigrant children clung to their families, he ventured into the streets, picking up English curse words first, then slang, then the rhythm of American speech. He discovered early that he had a gift, not just for learning but for reading people. He watched how bullies operated, how fear spread through groups, how confidence, even fake confidence, could turn a nobody into someone respected. This ability would one day make him one of the most influential mob bosses in American history, but for now it was simply a survival tool. School held no appeal for young Salvatore. The classrooms felt like cages, and the lessons seemed disconnected from the urgent demands of street life. By the time he was 10, he skipped classes regularly, preferring to hustle coins on the sidewalk or run small errands for older boys. He quickly learned that money, no matter how little, could earn favors, protection, and respect. One of his earliest hustles was offering to carry wealthy shoppers' bags for a nickel or two. For most kids, it was honest work. For Salvatore, it was the beginning of understanding business dynamics. If he hired younger kids to carry bags for him while he took the tips, he could earn more without lifting a finger. It was the first quiet proof that he was not built to follow, he was built to lead. The turning point in his early life came when he was roughly 14 years old. After being robbed and beaten by neighborhood boys, Salvatore vowed never to be a victim again. He refused to return home and cry to his parents. Instead, he returned to the streets with a new resolve. He befriended kids who, like him, were tired of being pushed around. Boys like Meyer Lansky, a sharp-minded Jewish kid with an icy stare and a brain for numbers. Their friendship would become one of the most important alliances in underworld history. But at this stage, they were simply two smart, ambitious boys recognizing strength in each other. When Salvatore saw Lansky stand up to a much bigger bully without flinching, he knew he had found someone who operated by intelligence rather than fear. that alignment would change everything. Around this time, Salvatore also encountered Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, another Jewish kid from the neighborhood, but the opposite of Lansky in personality. Siegel was unpredictable, hot-tempered, and utterly fearless. He loved violence almost as much as he loved money. Yet what impressed Salvatore was Siegel's absolute loyalty to his friends and his refusal to be intimidated by anyone. These friendships formed the foundation of a trio that would later reshape organized crime in America. Even as boys, their complementary strengths were clear. Lansky was the calculator, Siegel the enforcer, and Salvatore, the one who would someday become Lucky Luciano, was the strategist. The nickname Lucky came later, but the reasons behind it were earned early. Salvatore survived fights he had no business surviving. He dodged police raids that easily could have landed him in reform school. He maneuvered through dangerous situations with instinctive timing, leaving people wondering whether he was protected by fortune or simply smarter than those around him. In truth, it was both. Salvatore had an uncanny ability to understand risk, to sense when to push forward and when to vanish into the shadows. This talent wasn't luck, it was street intelligence sharpened through constant trial. By the time he reached his mid-teens, he had already embraced the logic of the underworld, that fear could be turned into profit and reputation could be turned into influence. He began charging young boys protection money, to keep bullies away, a tactic that both mirrored and mocked the extortion rackets of adult gangsters. This wasn't just childish play, it was Salvatore practicing the psychology of power. He learned that people followed the one who offered solutions, even if those solutions came at a cost. But the deeper truth was this. Even as a teenager, Salvatore didn't just want money, he wanted structure. He despised the pointless chaos of street fights and petty rivalries. He saw beyond the small hustles and imagined something bigger, something organized. While other boys fought for revenge or pride, Salvatore fought for positioning. Every friend he made, every enemy he cultivated, every lesson he absorbed was part of a silent blueprint forming in his mind. By the time he was 17, Salvatore Lucania was no longer a timid immigrant boy. He had become a rising figure in the Lower East Side's underground, connected to influential adult gangsters, respected by his peers, and feared by those who underestimated him. His ambition had matured into something cold, disciplined, and calculated. And though he didn't yet know it, every hardship of his youth, every beating, every hustle, every shifting alliance, was shaping him into the man the world would come to call Lucky Luciano. The boy had become a strategist. The strategist would soon become an empire builder. And the streets that raised him had unknowingly prepared him for a destiny that would forever alter the American underworld. By the time Salvatore Lucania crossed into adulthood, he was already operating on a different wavelength than the boys he grew up with. For most young gangsters, crime was a means of survival, quick money, temporary status, a way to avoid the crushing poverty of immigrant life. But for Salvatore, the streets were not an endpoint, they were an education. He had graduated from petty hustles and adolescent fights into a world where the stakes were higher, the players older, and the rewards infinitely bigger. This was the period when he stopped being a street kid reacting to life and instead became a man who shaped his own destiny. Every decision he made, every alliance he formed, every risk he took was part of a growing internal strategy. The transformation from thug to tactician did not happen in a single moment, it unfolded like a slow, deliberate sharpening of purpose. One of the earliest catalysts for this transformation was his immersion into the adult criminal world. Through his friendship with Meyer Lansky, Salvatore was introduced to circles far more sophisticated than local street gangs. He began meeting men who weren't just fighters, they were businessmen who controlled gambling dens, bootlegging routes, and labor rackets. These men understood money, politics, and influence. They showed Salvatore that power wasn't just about fear, it was about leveraging human nature. It was about building networks, managing risks, and understanding how to turn lawlessness into profit. This exposure rewired his thinking. He realized that raw violence could win a fight, but strategy could win an empire. Around this time, Salvatore also began working under established mafia bosses such as Giuseppe Joe the Boss, Masuria, and other figures connected to the old Sicilian ways. These men had direct ties to Italy's criminal traditions, rituals, codes, and hierarchies rooted in centuries-old culture. At first, Salvatore respected their authority, but the more he observed their methods, the more he recognized their flaws. The old bosses were stubborn, paranoid, and beholden to traditions that didn't fit the rapidly changing landscape of American crime. They treated New York as if it were still a Sicilian countryside, clinging to rituals and feuds that cost more lives than they earned money. Salvatore saw how old-world pride prevented collaboration and blinded leaders to opportunities. This realization formed a quiet rebellion in his mind. The belief that the Mafia needed a new generation, a new model, and a new kind of leadership. Another defining moment during this period was Salvatore's deepening relationship with political corruption. He gradually understood that crime did not exist in a vacuum. Judges, police captains, and politicians were not enemies, they were investments. Bribes could open doors. Influence could erase charges. A strategically placed donation could shield entire operations from scrutiny. Watching older gangsters handle political dealings gave Salvatore a new perspective. Real power lay not only in the streets but in the connections above them. If he could master both worlds, the criminal and the political, he could build something indestructible. This dual insight became a cornerstone of his evolution. Yet transformation rarely occurs without danger, and Salvatore's early ascent was marked by violence that forced him to refine his tactics. He survived assassination attempts, gang brawls, and double crosses that would have ended a less calculating man. In one infamous incident, he was kidnapped by rival gangsters who brutally beat and stabbed him, leaving him for dead. But he survived, barely. That event became the moment people began calling him lucky, but to Salvatore, it was more than just survival. It was proof of his own resilience. It also taught him that brute force without foresight made a man vulnerable. He vowed that his future plans would rely not on chance, but on intelligence and anticipation. Pain became his teacher, sharpening his ambition into something harder, more precise, more dangerous. This period also marked his deepening alliance with Lansky and Siegel. The three young men, each with different strengths, began functioning less like friends and more like a small council. They discussed territory, revenue, and opportunities. They debated strategy. They studied how other gangs operated and where they failed. They recognized that the future of crime was not in petty turf wars but in organized cooperation. Salvatore especially became obsessed with structure. He talked often about eliminating unnecessary violence, redirecting energy into business, and creating a network that could withstand pressure from law enforcement and rival groups alike. His friends listened, and slowly the foundation for a new criminal era took shape in their conversations. During this stage of transformation, Salvatore learned another crucial skill: patience. Where other young gangsters chased immediate gratification, he understood the value of waiting for the right moment. He took small positions under older bosses, played the loyal soldier, learned their strengths, and studied their weaknesses. To many he looked like a dutiful apprentice. But inside he was analyzing every detail: how decisions were made, where money came from, how alliances formed and dissolved. He was preparing. He was building a map of the underworld in his mind, marking every flaw and every opportunity. When the time came to challenge the old order, he wanted to be ready not just to win but to rebuild. Another significant evolution was his growing refusal to indulge in senseless brutality. He had witnessed too many gang leaders destroy their own networks through ego-driven violence. Salvatore preferred precision over chaos. Violence was not entertainment, it was a tool, one to be used rarely and strategically. This mindset set him apart from others his age, especially those who glorified gangster culture. Salvatore did not crave bloodshed, he craved order. He wanted a criminal ecosystem that made sense, one that rewarded calculated thinking instead of blind rage. This philosophy would later become the backbone of his leadership. By the end of his early 20s, Salvatore Lucania was no longer a street kid playing gangster. He had become a man with a plan, a long-term strategy to reshape the Mafia from the inside out. He understood the old ways but rejected their limitations. He saw the potential of new partnerships, new markets, and new structures. He had endured violence, betrayal, and failure, and each experience sharpened him further. The thug had evolved into a strategist, the follower into a future leader. And the world around him was shifting toward a moment when someone with his vision would step forward and pull the entire underworld into a new age. He was ready. The old world just didn't know it yet. By the late 1920s, Salvatore Lucania had reached a crossroads in his underworld evolution. The chaotic world he had grown up in, the brawls, the territorial feuds, the endless cycle of revenge, felt primitive, inefficient, and beneath the intelligence he had spent years refining. Crime was changing, America was changing, and Luciano understood with almost prophetic clarity that the old Mafia bosses were unprepared for the future. He had watched them cling to outdated traditions, fighting wars that bled money instead of generating it. The underworld, in his eyes, was a machine rusting from within, and he knew exactly how to rebuild it. This was the chapter where Luciano stopped dreaming of order and began constructing it piece by piece, alliance by alliance, decision by decision. It was the beginning of his empire. One of the first sparks of transformation came from Prohibition. When alcohol became illegal in 1920, America didn't suddenly stop drinking. It simply bought its liquor from the shadows. Demand exploded, and with it came a flood of opportunity. Small-time gangs scrambled to control bootlegging routes, bribe police, and run speakeasies. But Luciano saw something deeper. Prohibition wasn't just a criminal enterprise, it was a business empire waiting to be organized. Instead of fighting for small territories, he envisioned a network where multiple groups could cooperate, share profits, and reduce bloodshed. This thinking wasn't just unusual, it was revolutionary. It challenged everything the old Mafia believed. To build this revolution, Luciano needed allies who shared his vision. His closest confidants, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, were essential in this process. Lansky's brilliance with numbers and risk assessment allowed them to run bootlegging operations like corporate logistics. Siegel, with his cold-fire aggression, enforced discipline and protected their interests with lethal efficiency. Together, these three young men formed a triangle of power, each balancing the others, each pushing Luciano's ambitions further. It wasn't long before their network outperformed the older gangs who still relied on outdated brute force methods. However, the biggest obstacle to Luciano's rise was internal: the traditional Italian bosses. Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, two titans of the old guard, were locked in a bitter conflict known as the Castellammarese War. This war was tearing the Italian underworld apart, draining resources, destroying alliances, and creating a climate of paranoia where no one knew who to trust. Luciano understood immediately that the war was pointless. A fight between two men who wanted to control a structure that no longer worked. But as long as these men lived, progress was impossible. So Luciano made the most controversial choice of his life. He would dismantle the old order from the inside. Luciano first pretended to side with Masuria, acting as his loyal lieutenant while quietly forming alliances with Maranzano's supporters. He was playing both sides of the chessboard, always thinking 5 moves ahead. This dual loyalty allowed him to observe the weaknesses of both bosses. Masuria was stuck in the past, superstitious, paranoid, and incapable of adapting to America's fast-changing criminal landscape. Maranzano was more organized, more disciplined, but he was still consumed by Sicilian hierarchy and saw himself as a kind of Caesar of the underworld. Neither man had the vision Luciano possessed. Neither understood the potential of what American organized crime could become. The turning point came in 1931. Luciano orchestrated the murder of Joe Masuria inside a Coney Island restaurant, a killing executed with chilling precision by men Luciano trusted deeply: Lansky, Siegel, and other associates. With Masuria gone, Maranzano became the undisputed boss. But Luciano hadn't eliminated one dictator just to serve another. Within months, he realized Maranzano had no intention of modernizing the Mafia. Instead, he wanted to recreate a rigid Sicilian monarchy. He named himself Boss of Bosses, demanded tribute from every family, and began drawing up a hit list targeting rising young leaders, including Luciano himself. That sealed his fate. Luciano took action once again, this time organizing Maranzano's assassination in his office under the guise of a tax inspection. It was a clean, strategic kill that removed the last barrier blocking his evolution of the underworld. With the old bosses gone, the Mafia braced itself for chaos. But Luciano had no intention of becoming another dictator. Instead, he implemented something unheard of: he decentralized power. He created the Commission, a governing body made up of leaders from all major Mafia families, as well as key Jewish and Irish partners in crime. The Commission was designed to prevent future wars, mediate disputes, divide territories, and uphold order. It turned organized crime into a functional, disciplined industry. No one man would rule. Instead, the Commission would operate like a board of directors overseeing a national syndicate. This single innovation is what historians now consider Luciano's greatest achievement. It was the moment when the American Mafia transformed from a loose confederation of violent clans into a vast criminal corporation with regional bosses, profit-sharing agreements, and conflict resolution protocols. The Commission eliminated the destructive Boss of Bosses title that had plagued the Mafia for decades. It created balance, stability, and predictability, qualities that allowed the underworld to flourish like never before. But Luciano didn't stop there. He expanded alliances beyond the Italian-American community. He partnered with Jewish gangs, recognizing their intelligence and connections. He worked with Irish operators who controlled crucial political channels. His empire was not built on ethnicity, it was built on efficiency. He believed that power should flow to those who were competent, not just those who shared Sicilian blood. This thinking made him controversial among traditionalists but unstoppable among modern criminals. He was creating a new kind of mafia, diverse, interconnected, intelligently managed. Luciano also introduced another innovation, a focus on long-term profits instead of short-term turf victories. Instead of fighting over small corners of the city, he established syndicates for gambling, narcotics, prostitution, and labor racketeering. These networks operated like business departments with managers, accountants, and enforcers. He insisted on discipline, rejected unnecessary violence, and punished anyone who drew unnecessary attention from law enforcement. Under his leadership, the mafia became less visible but more powerful. It burrowed into unions, ports, nightclubs, and industries, quietly controlling the flow of money across entire sectors. His most impressive skill, however, was psychological. Luciano understood that men were motivated by fear, greed, pride, and loyalty in equal measure. He used each in precisely the right measure, balancing incentives with consequences. Associates who followed the rules thrived. Those who crossed him disappeared quietly. Everyone understood the message. Luciano's system promised prosperity, but only if the rules were respected. By the early 1930s, Luciano's transformation was complete. He had risen from a street kid to the architect of the modern American mafia. His empire stretched across states, his influence reached into politics, and his organizational model would shape organized crime for decades to come. The commission wasn't just a reform, it was a revolution, a blueprint for power built on discipline, cooperation, and strategy. Luciano had built the framework of a criminal dynasty larger than anything America had ever seen. And though the world had no idea yet, the golden age of the mafia had just begun, with Luciano standing firmly at its center. Before Lucky Luciano ever commanded an empire, he understood one fundamental truth. Power in the underworld did not rely on money alone. It relied on silence, on fear, on loyalty so deeply ingrained that men would rather die than speak a forbidden word. This unwritten law, the Code of Omerta, was not invented in America. It came from the ancient soil of Sicily, where distrust of authority had shaped generations. But in Luciano's hands, Omerta became more than tradition. It became a psychological weapon, a tool of social engineering, and a cornerstone of the empire he was building. To understand why Omerta mattered so much, one must understand its essence. At its core, it was a vow. Never cooperate with the police, never betray your brothers, never reveal the secrets of the family. Silence was not merely a tactic, it was a way of life. Breaking it was the ultimate sin, punishable by death without hesitation. For many early immigrants, this code felt natural. They had grown up in places where the authorities were corrupt, abusive, or foreign. In their eyes, justice came from community, not the government. But Luciano elevated this natural instinct into something strategic. He recognized that silence created stability, and stability created power. Under the old bosses, Omerta had been treated as a sacred tradition, almost religious in tone. But Luciano saw it differently, not as sacred but as practical. It wasn't enough to demand silence. He needed a structure that rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal with consistent discipline. Loyalty in Luciano's mind was like currency. Could be earned, invested, tested. He understood that men followed leaders who protected them, paid them fairly, and kept their families safe. He also understood that fear, applied sparingly but ruthlessly, prevented betrayal. The brilliance of his leadership was in how he balanced these forces. He gave his men reasons to stay loyal, but also reasons to never consider crossing him. Luciano's understanding of psychology played a major role in how he wielded Omerta. He knew that every man had weaknesses: family, money, pride, fear. Instead of ignoring these vulnerabilities, he studied them. He made sure that his soldiers felt valued, respected, and rewarded. He remembered wives' names, asked about children, offered help in private matters. These gestures were not sentimental, they were strategic. A man who felt seen by his boss was less likely to betray him. Luciano turned emotional intelligence into a leadership tool decades before anyone would call it that. But the other side of Omerta was equally important: the knowledge that betrayal meant annihilation. Luciano never used violence recklessly, but when someone broke the code, he made the consequences unforgettable. Killings were swift, often silent, carefully hidden from public view. There were no dramatic speeches. No opportunities for the condemned to plead their case. A man either upheld the code or died for violating it. The clarity of this rule created a psychological atmosphere where silence became instinctive. Even the thought of cooperating with authorities felt like walking into one's own grave. Luciano also transformed omerta from an individual vow into a collective identity. He taught his men that they were part of something larger, a system, a network, a family that transcended any single life. He emphasized discipline over chaos, cooperation over ego, profit over pride. Under his leadership, breaking omerta didn't just betray one person, it betrayed the entire structure. This shift in mentality created a sense of unity that the old mafia had never achieved. He turned a scattered collection of clans into a disciplined brotherhood. One of Luciano's most impressive talents was his ability to read intentions. He had an unusually sharp instinct for sensing betrayal before it happened. When someone hesitated, avoided eye contact, complained too much, or grew greedy, Luciano noticed. He monitored human behavior like a scientist studies patterns. This vigilance allowed him to act preemptively, removing threats before they metastasized. And when he eliminated a potential traitor, he did it quietly. The message spread without words. The boss knows everything. The boss sees everything. Fear, combined with admiration, created an unbreakable psychological grip. Another dimension of omerta under Luciano was how he tied it to opportunity. He offered pathways for ambitious men to rise in the ranks. The more loyal they remained, the more wealth they gained, the more power they received. Soldiers who demonstrated discipline could become capos. Capos who delivered profits and stability could rise even further. This merit-based approach was revolutionary in a world that had previously been dominated by family bloodlines and tradition. Luciano didn't care where a man came from. He cared how useful he was. But usefulness required trust, and trust required silence. In this way, omerta became the passport to advancement. It's important to note that Luciano did not romanticize the code like the old Sicilian bosses did. He didn't see it as a sacred relic, he saw it as infrastructure. It was the backbone of the system he built. Without omerta, the commission would crumble. Bootlegging operations would collapse. Union rackets would fall apart. Bribes would lose their value. The entire empire depended on secrecy, cooperation, and controlled fear. Luciano understood that institutions, whether legal or illegal, survive only when their members believe in something larger than themselves. Omerta was that belief. By reframing an ancient cultural code into a modern psychological system, Luciano achieved something remarkable. He took the chaos of the old mafia and disciplined it. He transformed fear from a weapon of unpredictability into a stabilizing force. He created an environment where loyalty wasn't just commanded, it was engineered. And in doing so, he laid the invisible foundation of what the American mafia would become for generations. In the end, omerta under Luciano was not merely silence. It was consent. It was identity. It was the invisible glue that held together the empire he had built. An empire where every man knew the rules, understood the stakes, and willingly played his part in a system designed by one brilliant mind. Luciano's true genius wasn't violence or intimidation. It was understanding the human heart, and knowing how to bind it forever to his cause. When Prohibition swept across America in 1920, most citizens saw it as a moral crusade. Churches celebrated, lawmakers proudly proclaimed the dawn of a sober nation, and reformers believed they had struck a blow against vice. But men like Lucky Luciano saw something entirely different. They saw opportunity, untouched, explosive, and overflowing with profit. Almost overnight, alcohol became the most valuable illegal commodity in the nation. What the government tried to ban, the public demanded with even greater hunger. And Luciano understood early that whoever controlled the supply would control the streets, the clubs, and the future of organized crime. This section marks the moment he shifted from simply reorganizing the mafia to turning it into a multi-million-dollar engine of criminal enterprise. Unlike the older bosses who fought over scraps, Luciano looked at the liquor business with a strategist's eye. He didn't want to control just a few speakeasies, he wanted to control the pipeline. He analyzed the chain of production the same way a businessman analyzes a corporate model. Importing, distribution, partnerships, enforcement, and political insulation. He handpicked suppliers in Canada and the Caribbean, arranged secure transportation routes, and used corrupt police contacts to protect shipments. His bootlegging network wasn't just a criminal operation, it was a logistics powerhouse. Truck drivers, dock workers, bartenders, politicians, and enforcers were all part of the machine. Every piece served a purpose, and every purpose served profit. But Luciano's true genius came from understanding that no empire could survive on one product alone. While others obsessed over alcohol, he diversified. He built gambling rings that operated in hotels, backrooms, and private clubs. He stepped into narcotics, not recklessly but strategically, importing heroin in controlled amounts through tight routes, avoiding the chaotic, small-time dealers who attracted too much attention. He infiltrated labor unions, installing trusted men into leadership positions so he could influence ports, construction sites, trucking companies, and factories. Union racketeering became one of the Mafia's most powerful tools because it gave them leverage over entire industries. Luciano saw this before others even realized the potential. To maintain these operations, he relied heavily on the brains of Meyer Lansky, the man who could track numbers with surgical precision. Lansky helped design money laundering systems that confused investigators and protected revenue streams. Under their partnership, gambling wasn't just a backroom activity, it became an organized, multi-city network. Bookmakers followed structured guidelines. Profits were tracked, shared, and reinvested. Violence was used only when absolutely necessary. Luciano and Lansky ran crime the way banks run investments, with discipline and long-term planning. Where Luciano truly broke from tradition, however, was in his approach to collaboration. He didn't believe in racial or ethnic boundaries. Italian gangs had historically refused to work with Jewish or Irish crews, but Luciano saw such divisions as childish. He formed alliances with Dutch Schultz, Auni Madden, and other non-Italian figures because he understood that money didn't care about heritage. Schultz controlled lucrative numbers rackets, and Madden owned nightclubs and speakeasies that became key distribution points for bootleg liquor. By partnering instead of fighting, Luciano reduced risk and increased revenue for everyone involved. This philosophy of cross-ethnic cooperation allowed him to dominate markets where Sicilian families had never previously held power. Jewish financial networks, Irish political contacts, and Italian muscle fused into something unstoppable. The underworld ceased to be a patchwork of fighting tribes and began to resemble a syndicate, a living organism with Luciano at its core. These alliances mirrored legitimate corporations, with each group controlling a division of labor. Luciano simply described it as good business. Yet with expansion came danger, and Luciano approached each challenge with his characteristic psychological precision. He understood that stability required controlling not just his enemies but also the men who worked under him. The Mafia families were filled with ambitious, violent personalities who could destabilize operations if left unchecked. Luciano implemented a system of checks and balances, capos who ruled territories, soldiers who carried out orders, and accountants who monitored revenue. He insisted on meeting profits rather than hearing excuses. He demanded updates. He listened to complaints but rewarded efficiency, not flattery. His command wasn't maintained through constant fear but through predictable structure and rational leadership. Despite his growing power, Luciano never lost sight of discretion. He warned his men that attention was poison. Clubs were to operate quietly. Bribes were to be delivered subtly. Nightclubs could be glamorous, but the men behind them must remain shadows. The public could enjoy the illusion of nightlife without ever knowing who controlled the flow of money behind the scenes. This philosophy insulated the syndicate from unnecessary law enforcement pressure, at least for a time. Another crucial element of his business expansion was how he handled competition. Luciano believed in negotiation before violence. If a rival gang wanted territory, he offered partnerships. If they refused, he offered buyouts. Only when all diplomacy failed did he authorize eliminations. Even then, he ensured that hits were conducted cleanly, with minimal noise and maximum efficiency. Violence was an investment, not a spectacle. This mindset reduced the number of street wars dramatically, allowing profits to rise across the board. For the first time in American criminal history, peace became more valuable than bloodshed. Luciano also revolutionized the way the Mafia interacted with legitimate businesses. Through union control, he quietly infiltrated construction companies, shipping lines, garment factories, and ports. These sectors became permanent income streams. If a shipment needed to pass without inspection, dockworkers made sure it did. If a company needed a contract approved, Luciano's influence in the unions and political offices accelerated the process. The line between legal and illegal blurred until it became nearly invisible. By the early 1930s, Luciano's empire had grown into a network so vast and complex that it resembled a corporation with national reach. Every region, every product, every industry flowed into the pockets of the commission he created. Money poured in from nightclubs, casinos, brothels, smuggling rings, loan sharking operations, and labor rackets. Each operation was efficient, coordinated, and scalable. Luciano didn't invent crime, but he engineered it into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that functioned like a Fortune 500 company with bullets instead of boardrooms. At the center of this empire stood a man who understood something no lawmaker ever did: that people would always crave what they were forbidden to have. And as long as there was demand, Luciano would supply it. This section marks the height of his rise, the moment when the underworld was no longer a collection of criminals but a fully formed business empire, crafted by the mind of a man who saw opportunity where others saw chaos. As Lucky Luciano's empire grew, so did the complexity of the world around him. The criminal underworld was never a place where alliances lasted forever. Friends could become enemies overnight, rivals could turn into partners by sunrise, and loyalty could shift with a single whispered promise of power. Luciano understood this better than anyone. He navigated these shifting sands not with brute force, but with psychological mastery, studying men, anticipating their motives, and positioning himself so that every alliance, every betrayal, every conflict served his long-term strategy. This section marks the stage in his rise where the people around him, friends, traitors and kingmakers alike, shaped the future of his empire. Among his most steadfast allies was Meyer Lansky, the man who shared Luciano's vision for a modernized underworld. Their friendship was not built on ethnic loyalty or childhood sentiment. It was built on mutual respect for intelligence and ambition. Lansky saw in Luciano a leader capable of uniting the fractured world of organized crime, and Luciano saw in Lansky a brain sharp enough to make that vision profitable. Together, they became the architects of a criminal syndicate that transcended old traditions. If Luciano was the strategist, Lansky was the mathematician who turned plans into revenue. Their partnership became the backbone of the Mafia's expansion across gambling, unions, narcotics, and international operations. Bugsy Siegel, on the other hand, represented something different: raw energy, charisma, and fearless aggression. Siegel was the blade Luciano used when diplomacy failed. Though unpredictable and hot-tempered, Siegel's loyalty to Luciano was absolute. He respected Luciano's ability to think several moves ahead, and Luciano valued Siegel's talent for enforcing order without hesitation. Their bond created a balance between intellect and muscle, a dynamic that helped keep the syndicate stable in its most volatile years. But for every ally, there was an enemy watching, plotting, or waiting for a moment of weakness. One of the most dangerous rivalries Luciano faced was with Dutch Schultz, the volatile bootlegger who controlled lucrative numbers rackets. Schultz was powerful, violent, and arrogantly unpredictable. He despised rules and refused to be controlled. Luciano, however, disliked chaos. Schultz's reckless public behavior threatened the stability Luciano worked so hard to build, especially after Schultz openly discussed assassinating prosecutor Thomas Dewey, a plan that would have drawn catastrophic federal pressure on the entire underworld. Luciano found himself in a dilemma: protect order or allow Schultz's madness to destabilize everything. The commission voted, under Luciano's guidance, to eliminate Schultz. It was not personal, it was management. The hit was carried out efficiently, proving that Luciano's leadership extended beyond his immediate circle. He could balance compassion for allies with the cold necessity of removing threats. The death of Schultz became a message to every mobster in America. Rules mattered, stability mattered, and no man, no matter how powerful, was above the syndicate's need for survival. Yet external enemies were only part of the equation. The more dangerous threats came from within. The Mafia was filled with ambitious men, some loyal to Luciano's vision, others loyal only to themselves. Capos whispered in backrooms, judging Luciano's alliances with Jewish and Irish gangs. Traditionalists complained he was abandoning the purity of Sicilian heritage. Some feared his increasing influence within unions and international smuggling channels. Others feared something even more powerful: his ability to inspire loyalty without intimidation. A leader who controls through respect is harder to overthrow than one who commands through fear. One of the most notable internal rivals during this period was Vincent Mangano, who resented Luciano's authority and disliked his cooperation with non-Italian partners. Mangano believed the Mafia should remain strictly Sicilian and restricted in its alliances. Luciano ignored him, knowing that innovation always attracts resistance. He understood that if he responded to every insult or disagreement with violence, he would fall into the same trap that had consumed Masuria and Maranzano. Instead, Luciano focused on results. Money silenced critics far more effectively than bullets. But not all dissent could be ignored. Some capos saw Luciano's success as an opportunity to rise by betraying him. Informants grew bolder. FBI surveillance increased. Rival families probed for weaknesses. Luciano responded by tightening his inner circle. He met more frequently with Lansky. He trusted Siegel to eliminate threats that couldn't be diplomatically resolved. And above all, he kept a close eye on those who talked too much or asked too many questions. It was during this period that Lucky's understanding of betrayal reached its peak. He learned that traitors rarely appear as enemies, they appear as allies who speak too softly. The ones who smile too quickly. The ones who ask for too many favors. So Luciano developed a subtle habit. He tested people. He used misinformation to expose spies. He delayed decisions to observe loyalty. He offered small opportunities to see who would reach too quickly for power. These quiet psychological strategies allowed him to identify future threats before they materialized. But alliances were not only about control, they were also about opportunity. Luciano's connections with Irish political machines protected his operations. His relationships with Jewish businessmen expanded gambling operations into Cuba and other regions. His partnerships with Italian and Sicilian families secured manpower and discipline. Every connection, every handshake, every favor contributed to the internal stability of his empire. As Luciano navigated these alliances, he also positioned himself as a kingmaker. He raised promising young men to positions of influence, shaping their futures and strengthening his own network. He brokered peace between families, resolved disputes, and oversaw territory divisions with a calm, businesslike approach. This earned him enormous respect. Even those who disliked Luciano personally could not deny that his leadership produced unprecedented profits and stability. He had achieved what his predecessors could not, a unified underworld operating like a nationwide corporation. Yet in the shadows, danger always persisted. For every ally who supported Luciano's vision, another waited for him to stumble. The underworld was a kingdom built on ambition, and ambition could turn even the closest friend into a future enemy. Luciano knew this. He accepted it. He thrived in it. Friends, traitors, kingmakers, each played a role in the empire he built. Each helped shape his rise. And each would shape the storm that soon approached. For in the world of organized crime, the higher a man climbs, the more enemies gather quietly beneath him, waiting, watching, plotting. Luciano sensed it, and he prepared for what would come next. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano was at the peak of his power. The commission was functioning like a boardroom of underworld executives. The bootlegging empire was thriving, gambling rackets stretched across multiple states, and union infiltration had turned labor industries into profitable gold mines. To the public, Luciano was a ghost, rarely seen, never photographed, always one step removed from the violence and operations he orchestrated. But beneath this polished image, a silent war was intensifying. Rivals still lurked in the shadows, federal eyes were sharpening their focus, and political winds were changing. Luciano understood that while he had defeated old-world enemies, the next threats would be more sophisticated, more unpredictable, and more dangerous. The hidden war was not fought with bullets alone, it was fought with strategy, psychology, and survival. One of the biggest pressures came from within the Mafia itself. The commission was created to prevent major conflicts, but it couldn't eliminate ambition. Some families questioned Luciano's partnerships with Jewish associates. Others envied the wealth he generated through his international connections. And a few secretly believed they could replace him. Luciano sensed this tension the way a seasoned hunter senses a shift in the wind. He knew that any sign of weakness would embolden potential traitors. So he projected stability, attending selective meetings, resolving disputes with calm authority, and ensuring his decisions always benefited the families financially. Money was armor. As long as everyone prospered, dissent remained manageable. But even internal threats were nothing compared to what was emerging from outside. The American public had become increasingly frustrated with crime. Newspapers published sensational headlines about gangland murders, bootleg wars, and rampant corruption. Politicians, needing to show strength, launched reform campaigns. And into this environment rose a man who would become Luciano's greatest legal adversary, Thomas E. Dewey. A young, ambitious prosecutor with an iron reputation, Dewey saw the Mafia not as untouchable but as a challenge worth pursuing. He built his career on dismantling criminal networks and exposing corruption. To Dewey, Luciano was not a myth, he was a target. Luciano recognized the threat immediately. Dewey wasn't corruptible, wasn't intimidated, and wasn't swayed by political favors. He was a new kind of enemy, clean, determined, and relentless. Luciano had dealt with violent rivals, traitors, and unpredictable gangsters, but a man like Dewey required an entirely different strategy. Luciano tightened his operations, removed visible associates, and reduced his public appearances. He insulated himself behind layers of intermediaries. To most he looked untouchable. But Dewey didn't need to catch Luciano with his own hands, he just needed a crack in the Mafia's armor. And that crack appeared in the form of vice operations, specifically prostitution rings. Luciano didn't manage these operations personally, but they were part of the syndicate's income. Brothels paid protection money, madams cooperated with Luciano's men, and profits quietly flowed upward. It wasn't one of his major ventures, but it was vulnerable. It involved street-level workers, people with no loyalty, no discipline, and no understanding of omerta. These low-level operations lacked the sophistication of bootlegging or gambling networks. Dewey saw this weakness and exploited it. Undercover agents raided brothels and interrogated the workers. Some broke under pressure. Others fabricated stories under fear. Men eager to cut deals exaggerated Luciano's involvement. Dewey collected testimonies, building a narrative that Luciano ran a massive prostitution empire. Whether true or not didn't matter. Luciano understood that perception, once formed, became its own weapon. Meanwhile, the hidden war extended beyond Dewey. Federal agencies were beginning to share information with one another. Wiretaps, surveillance, and undercover informants increased. Newspapers sensationalized every mob-related arrest. Public tolerance for organized crime was dwindling. The underworld had grown too large, too profitable, too visible. Politicians needed victories, and Luciano's arrest would be the crown jewel of any career. At the same time, old rivalries simmered. Some mobsters believed Luciano's downfall would open new opportunities. Jealousy is a constant shadow in the criminal world. Men who smiled in meetings whispered in the dark. Luciano sensed betrayal in certain corners but couldn't pinpoint the source. The hidden war was no longer just external, it was internal, subtle, and unpredictable. Even as pressure mounted, Luciano maintained his calm. He believed in timing, in controlling emotions, in letting enemies reveal themselves before taking action. He still held influence over unions, ports, gambling houses, and international smuggling operations. But the growing scrutiny meant he had to operate with surgical precision. One mistake could open the door to disaster. His greatest dilemma during this period was balancing stability with invisibility. If he retreated too far, rivals would see weakness. If he remained too active, law enforcement would tighten the noose. Luciano chose the middle path, appearing in carefully selected social circles, attending events that reinforced his status, yet never exposing himself unnecessarily. Even his clothing choices were strategic, elegant but not extravagant, visible but not flamboyant. He understood that image was part of survival. But Dewey was relentless. He gathered dozens of witnesses, some willing, some coerced, until he had enough to charge Luciano. The irony was that the charges did not reflect the true scale of Luciano's empire. The hidden war had not exposed his gambling syndicates, his union influence, or his international deals. Instead, it targeted one of his least important operations. But that didn't matter in the eyes of the law. Dewey's goal was not accuracy, it was headline victory. Luciano's arrest in 1936 shocked the underworld. For years he had seemed immune to legal consequences. The idea of Lucky Luciano, master strategist, architect of the commission, being handcuffed felt surreal. But it was a reminder of the reality he always understood. Power invites enemies, and the greatest threats are often invisible until they strike. As Luciano was taken into custody, the hidden war reached its climax. Allies scrambled to protect operations. Rivals measured their chances. Politicians celebrated. Newspapers glorified Dewey as a hero. And for the first time, Luciano faced a battle he couldn't control from behind the scenes. A courtroom war where his greatest weapons, discipline, fear, loyalty, were tested in ways he had never imagined. The hidden war was over. The public war, the trial, was about to begin. When Lucky Luciano was arrested on April 1, 1936, it didn't feel real, not to the underworld, not to the public, and not even to Luciano himself. A man who had survived assassins, gang wars, betrayals, and the violent transformation of the Mafia was suddenly undone by charges tied to prostitution, a racket he barely touched. It felt anticlimactic, almost absurd. But Luciano knew immediately that this was not about the charges. It was about momentum. It was about politics. It was about Thomas Dewey needing a victory big enough to define his career. And it was about the invisible forces that had been tightening around him for years. The fall did not happen in a single moment. It happened through a series of miscalculations, betrayals, and shifting political tides that even a man like Luciano could not fully control. The arrest itself was orchestrated with theatrical flair. Dewey wanted the public to see it, the newspapers to document it, and the courts to frame it as the capture of the boss of bosses. Luciano had always been cautious, always aware of his surroundings, but on that particular day he let his guard down. He was staying at the Hot Springs Resort in Arkansas, an area famous for organized crime figures seeking comfort, treatment, or anonymity. But the illusion of safety turned out to be foolish. The local police, under pressure from federal authorities, ambushed him in his room. He was alone, unarmed, and momentarily stunned. For the first time in years, he wasn't controlling the situation. Someone else was. As he sat in custody, Luciano's mind raced. He analyzed every connection, every partner, every rival. He replayed recent conversations looking for signs of betrayal. Had someone tipped off Dewey? Had a rival made a deal? Had an associate cracked under pressure? The truth was complicated. Luciano's empire had grown so large, so decentralized, that even the slightest weakness in one corner could expose the whole operation. Prostitution rings, run by people far removed from the commission, were chaotic and difficult to control. It wasn't surprising that someone somewhere had slipped. But what stung Luciano most was that he hadn't seen this threat coming. He had anticipated rival bosses, political shifts, even federal initiatives, but not this. The extradition to New York was humiliating. On the train ride back, officers treated him not as a feared underworld figure, but as a trophy. Newspapers announced his capture with triumphant headlines. Dewey, ever the strategist, made public statements painting Luciano as the mastermind of vice and corruption. The perception was being shaped long before the trial began. Luciano understood this better than anyone. In the court of public opinion he was already halfway convicted. His associates scrambled to protect operations, but he knew the damage was done. Arrests rippled across the prostitution network. Informants came forward, some out of fear, others out of coercion, many out of sheer desperation. These were not the hardened soldiers Luciano trusted. These were workers, madams, low-level pimps, people with no loyalty to Omerta. Dewey counted on this and it worked. Statements piled up, each one adding weight to the narrative Dewey was crafting. Whether true, exaggerated, or completely fabricated didn't matter. They were recorded, signed, sealed, and ready to be weaponized. Meanwhile, the press portrayed Luciano as a shadow king who controlled every criminal act in New York. Reporters described luxury apartments, glamorous nightlife, and whispered meetings in smoky backrooms. They painted him as a villain with almost supernatural power. Luciano knew the irony. Most of his real influence came from discipline, planning, and cooperation, not cartoonish villainy. But the public didn't want nuance. They wanted a monster. And Dewey handed them one. In the days leading up to the trial, Luciano confronted the growing reality. He might not win this fight. He had always been a master of contingency. Every plan had a backup. Every backup had an escape route. But this time the battlefield was different. He couldn't intimidate witnesses. He couldn't bribe Dewey. He couldn't outthink the political machine turning against him. For the first time he faced a war where his usual weapons were useless. Behind the scenes, the commission debated how to respond. Some wanted to help Luciano escape. Others insisted the syndicate must distance itself to survive. Luciano, even with his future collapsing around him, insisted on one thing: no war. No chaos. No retaliation. He understood that if the Mafia reacted violently, Dewey would use it to justify a full-scale federal crackdown, one that could cripple the entire organization. His final act as free leader wasn't self-preservation, it was strategic sacrifice. He told his men to stay calm, continue business, and trust the structure he built. Even in crisis, Luciano chose discipline. His reflections during these days were private. He thought about the early years on the streets, his rise from poverty, the assassinations of Masuria and Maranzano, the creation of the commission, and the empire he had built from nothing. Part of him knew that no criminal kingpin reigns forever. The higher a man climbs, the more enemies sharpen their knives below. He had seen it happen to his predecessors. Now it was happening to him. But what hurt more than the threat of prison was the idea that his downfall wasn't caused by a grand betrayal or a calculated enemy. It was caused by something messy, imperfect, and beneath his level of operation. A prostitution case. A collection of small-time workers. A prosecutor hungry for fame. Luciano wasn't falling because he failed as a strategist, he was falling because the world around him had changed. The hidden war had evolved into a political crusade, and he was the chosen target. As he sat in his cell awaiting trial, he made peace with one final realization. Power is always temporary. Influence, money, fear, they all fade. But structure, systems, and ideas survive. The commission would continue. The syndicate would adapt. His empire would live on even if he did not. This thought gave him a bittersweet comfort. The fall had begun, but Luciano was not defeated. Not yet. The courtroom fight was coming. And while he couldn't stop the storm, he could face it with the same precision and control that built his empire. The strategist within him never stopped calculating. Even in chains he was thinking, observing, preparing. For Luciano, survival wasn't a matter of circumstance, it was a matter of mind. When the trial of Lucky Luciano began in May 1936, the courtroom transformed into a stage, and every actor played their role with dramatic precision. Prosecutor Thomas Dewey stood at the center, confident and sharp, determined to prove that the most powerful mobster in America was nothing more than a criminal puppeteer controlling a sprawling prostitution empire. Luciano, dressed impeccably as always, sat calmly at the defense table, his face unreadable, his posture disciplined. He knew the eyes of the nation were on him. Newspapers filled their front pages with his name, photographers swarmed the courthouse steps, and the public hungered for a spectacle. This trial was not just about legal guilt, it was about image, power, and public perception. Dewey knew it. Luciano knew it. Everyone in that courtroom understood the theater unfolding before them. From the beginning, the prosecution's strategy relied on emotion and narrative rather than concrete evidence. Dewey presented a parade of witnesses, madams, prostitutes, pimps, many of whom had been arrested, threatened, or coaxed into testifying. Some shook uncontrollably on the stand. Others looked terrified to even utter Luciano's name. A few whispered their answers, glancing nervously toward the defense table as if expecting retaliation. Dewey used their fear as proof of Luciano's power. Whether they truly knew him or not didn't matter. The image of control, intimidation, and influence was enough to sway the jury. Luciano watched quietly, analyzing each witness, noting inconsistencies, recognizing which testimonies were rehearsed and which were genuine. But he also saw something far more troubling. The jury wasn't judging evidence. They were judging reputation. Dewey's questioning was calculated and theatrical. He framed Luciano as the mastermind of vice, the unseen force behind hundreds of brothels. He described him as a man who grew rich off the suffering of vulnerable women. He painted a picture of a criminal corporation so vast that only a man of Luciano's intelligence could have built it. Ironically, Dewey's arguments indirectly acknowledged Luciano's brilliance, but used it as a weapon against him. On the other side, Luciano's defense attorneys argued that he had no direct involvement in prostitution rings, no financial records linking him to the brothels, and no specific evidence tying him to management decisions. But arguments rooted in logic struggled against the emotional momentum Dewey had created. The courtroom atmosphere was tense every day. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every glance, every smirk, every clash between lawyers. Spectators fought for seats, hoping to glimpse the legendary mobster they had heard about in whispered stories. Some expected a monster. Others expected a charismatic outlaw. But what they witnessed was a man composed, intelligent, and respectful. Luciano's calm demeanor frustrated Dewey, who wanted to provoke reactions that would reveal arrogance or guilt. Luciano refused to give him the satisfaction. His control was absolute even under pressure. Behind the scenes, the situation was even more chaotic. Some witnesses recanted statements. Others disappeared mysteriously before testifying. Rumors circulated about bribes, threats, and secret deals. Dewey worked tirelessly to keep the trial on track, pushing forward with determination. He knew that convicting Luciano would make him a national hero, a symbol of victory over organized crime. Luciano understood this, and privately he admired Dewey's ambition. In another life, under different circumstances, he might have respected the prosecutor as a worthy rival. But in this moment, Dewey was the architect of his downfall. When Luciano took the stand in his own defense, the courtroom fell silent. Reporters leaned forward, pencils poised. Even Dewey's expression tightened. Luciano answered every question with clarity, intelligence, and composure. He denied involvement in prostitution, described his legitimate business ventures, and explained his background without aggression or fear. But no matter how well he spoke, the weight of the testimonies already given hung over the trial like a dark cloud. The public wanted a villain. Dewey had given them one. And the jury, consciously or not, absorbed every headline, every whisper, every newspaper photo that framed Luciano as the king of vice. The closing arguments became the trial's climax. Dewey spoke with fiery conviction, painting Luciano as a man who used fear, power, and manipulation to control the lives of countless women. He called him dangerous, calculating, and heartless. The defense countered by highlighting the lack of hard evidence, the questionable credibility of witnesses, and the political motivations behind the prosecution. But momentum was no longer on their side. Luciano could feel it, the shift, the inevitability. Power, which had always been his shield, was now being used as proof of guilt. When the jury returned a verdict of guilty, the courtroom erupted with noise, gasps, murmurs, whispered celebrations from those aligned with Dewey. Luciano remained still. No flinch, no anger, no surrender. Only silence. The sentence was announced, 30 to 50 years in prison. It was a devastating blow, not just to Luciano but to the entire criminal syndicate he had built. Dewey had struck at the symbolic heart of organized crime. And he had succeeded. As Luciano was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the flashbulbs exploded like gunfire. Reporters shouted questions, some triumphant, others stunned. But Luciano kept walking, chin up, expression unchanged. He would not let the world see defeat. That last moment of dignity was a weapon too, one he wielded even as the system closed around him. For the first time in his adult life, Luciano was powerless in a world he did not control. The empire he built still stood, but he would no longer command it freely. His fall was not a collapse, it was a quiet, inevitable descent orchestrated by enemies who had used the law, not bullets, to bring him down. And as he entered the next phase of his life, prison, he carried with him only the tools that had always served him best: discipline, intelligence, and an unbreakable mind. When Lucky Luciano entered Clinton Correctional Facility, better known as Dannemora Prison, he walked into a world designed to break men. The walls were cold and unforgiving, the routine brutal, the hierarchy rigid. To the guards he was inmate number 92168. To the newspapers he was the fallen king of organized crime. But Luciano did not see himself as defeated. Prison, in his mind, was another environment to understand, another system to navigate, another battlefield to master. Bars could restrict his body but they could not restrain his mind. And in that mindset lay the foundation for how he would continue to wield influence even while locked away. The first shock for many inmates was how unbothered Luciano appeared. He didn't beg for favors, didn't flaunt his reputation, didn't attempt to intimidate anyone. Instead he observed. He watched how guards interacted, how inmates traded contraband, how information flowed through the cell blocks. Luciano had always been a student of human behavior, and prison offered a new set of variables, a new ecosystem to decode. Within days he understood the unwritten rules: who controlled the gambling, who ran the kitchens, who smuggled cigarettes, who had influence over guards, and who was secretly terrified. Knowledge became his currency, and quietly, without making waves, he began to build a network. The guards initially treated him with a mix of curiosity and contempt. Some wanted to see the notorious mobster broken. Others wanted stories, whispers about the commission, about assassinations, about deals made in Manhattan backrooms. Luciano gave them nothing. His silence wasn't fear, it was strategy. The less he said, the more they wondered. And curiosity, he knew, could be shaped into advantage. A few guards eventually warmed to him, drawn by his calm manner and polite demeanor. For them, Luciano became a fascinating puzzle. A man they expected to be violent or arrogant but found articulate and respectful instead. In prison culture, that unexpected contrast earned him attention. Among inmates, rumors circulated immediately. Some claimed Luciano had secret tunnels waiting to free him. Others insisted he controlled politicians even from his cell. The myth grew even without his participation. Luciano let the story spread. Power in prison wasn't about physical dominance, it was about perception. If inmates believed he had influence outside, they would approach him with caution. If they believed he could solve problems, they would come to him with offers. And they did. Inmates approached with small requests: protection, mediation, advice. Luciano listened. Sometimes he helped, sometimes he declined. But he always made it clear that respect had to be earned. One of the most surprising outcomes of Luciano's imprisonment was the new set of alliances he formed. In the outside world he worked mostly with Italian, Jewish, and Irish criminal circles. But prison brought him into contact with figures he would never have encountered otherwise: corrupt officials, disgraced businessmen, violent loners, political radicals. Some had information. Some had connections. Some simply had skills he could use. Luciano treated prison like a laboratory, studying people, identifying potential assets, and understanding how the system could be influenced from within. Even with all these relationships, Luciano never forgot his position. He was not running the Mafia anymore, not directly. But the commission he created was designed to survive without him. Messages still found their way to him through visiting lawyers and coded conversations. He asked about family stability, disputes, revenue streams, and alliances. He didn't give orders, he gave suggestions, guidance, philosophy. In many ways, his leadership evolved. He became less of a commander and more of a mentor, guiding the syndicate through counsel rather than force. His mind remained a cornerstone of the organization even though his hands could no longer touch it. Prison also forced Luciano into a rare period of introspection. He thought about the path that had brought him here, the rise from street kid to underworld architect, the wars he helped end, the structure he built, and the decision that ultimately exposed him to Dewey's prosecution. He realized that he had underestimated how rapidly America was changing. The public no longer saw criminals as romantic rogues, they saw them as threats to society. Politicians needed heroes, prosecutors needed victories, and the Mafia had become too big, too visible, too tempting a target. Luciano understood this shift with a clarity that few others possessed. He recognized that he had built something too successful, an empire so stable and efficient that it had drawn attention at the highest levels. But reflection didn't weaken him. It sharpened him. Luciano began thinking about his legacy, what would survive after him. He emphasized to his visitors the importance of consistency, discipline, and cooperation. He insisted that the commission remain strong and united. He pushed for modernizing strategies, keeping violence low, and avoiding unnecessary public attention. Even behind bars, he influenced the cultural evolution of the Mafia. Over time, Luciano's relationships with guards deepened. Some admired his intelligence. Others respected his quiet dignity. A few benefited from his subtle assistance, help with family problems, networking after retirement, financial guidance. He never bribed directly, but he created loyalty through reciprocity and conversation. This earned him privileges, small but meaningful. Better assignments. More private visits. Access to inmates he needed to speak with. In a place designed to strip men of power, Luciano had carved out a controlled bubble of influence. But despite the stability he built within prison walls, Luciano knew one truth. A prisoner is still a prisoner. Steel bars are steel bars no matter how much respect a man earns. Nights were long and quiet. The noise of the cell block echoed endlessly. And for the first time in his life, time was something he could not control. It flowed slowly, indifferent to his intellect or ambition. Yet even in confinement, Luciano remained something formidable. A mind no prison could break, a strategist no sentence could silence. His empire continued, his name carried weight, and his legacy was already cementing itself into the structure of organized crime. Prison had taken his freedom, but it had not taken his influence. He remained a leader, even from the inside. And soon, circumstances far beyond his imagination would present him with an unexpected path to power he never expected to reclaim. When the gates of Dannemora finally closed behind Lucky Luciano for the last time, it wasn't freedom that waited for him, it was exile. In 1946, after a decade behind bars, Luciano was released in recognition of his wartime assistance to the U.S. government. Through his influence over dockworkers and criminal networks, he had helped protect American ports from sabotage during World War II. It was an ironic twist. The same government that had condemned him now relied on the structure he built. But the price of this cooperation was steep. Luciano was deported to Italy, stripped of his American citizenship, and barred from returning to the country where he had built his empire. He stepped off the ship not as a king or a criminal mastermind, but as a man severed from the world he once ruled. Italy welcomed him with curiosity but not reverence. To many Italians he was a stranger with a famous name, a man shaped by America, not Sicily. The underworld in Italy operated differently, with its own traditions, hierarchies, and codes. Luciano might have been a legend overseas, but here he had no real authority. Still he observed, learned, and adapted. His instinct for understanding power dynamics had not faded. He recognized immediately that Italy's criminal landscape was fractured in ways reminiscent of the old New York he had once reorganized. But Luciano no longer had the physical reach or political freedom to impose structure. Surveillance followed him everywhere. Italian authorities tracked his movements, monitored his visitors, and ensured that he never grew too comfortable. But Luciano was not a man who surrendered easily. Exile didn't extinguish his ambition, it redirected it. He set his sights on Cuba, a vibrant haven for nightlife, gambling, and international crime. Havana was emerging as a paradise for rich Americans and ambitious mobsters alike. With Meyer Lansky already establishing lucrative gambling operations on the island, Luciano saw an opportunity. If he couldn't return to America, he could at least position himself close enough to influence the syndicate. Cuba was the perfect middle ground, outside U.S. jurisdiction, yet connected to American tourism and money. Luciano traveled to Havana under a cloud of secrecy, slipping past restrictive oversight long enough to join Lansky in transforming the island into a criminal playground. Casinos glittered with wealth. Nightclubs pulsed with music, alcohol, and illicit deals. High-profile mobsters flew in for meetings that felt like royal gatherings. Luciano, despite his legal exile, was treated like a returning king. This was the closest he had come to reclaiming the life he had lost, and for a brief moment he tasted power again. The influence, the respect, the feeling of directing something larger than himself. But the world had changed, and so had the U.S. government. When word spread that Luciano was conducting business in Havana, authorities pressured Cuba to expel him. They feared that his presence would reignite old criminal networks and strengthen the Mafia's international influence. Under mounting pressure, the Cuban government arrested him and placed him on another ship back to Italy. His attempt to re-enter the sphere of American organized crime had been short-lived. The message was clear: there was no going back. The return to Italy marked the beginning of the end. Luciano realized that his era was fading. The Mafia in America had evolved. New leaders had risen, new alliances had formed, and new enemies demanded attention. While the Commission still respected him as a founding architect, they no longer depended on him for direction. The structure he created had grown beyond the man who built it. This recognition was both painful and oddly satisfying. Luciano had always believed in systems over individuals, and now he was witnessing his philosophy in full effect. The empire would survive without him, because it was designed to. In Naples, Luciano lived a quieter but still watchful life. He occupied a modest apartment, spent afternoons in cafes, and walked streets filled with people who barely recognized him. Yet he remained under constant surveillance. Italian authorities suspected him of coordinating narcotics trafficking, and American agents tracked him from afar, convinced he still influenced the underworld. Luciano denied involvement in drugs repeatedly, insisting he had stepped away from the criminal life. But whether he truly detached himself or simply operated more discreetly remains a matter of debate. As years passed, Luciano's world shrank. The high-stakes meetings became phone calls. The empires he helped build became stories relayed by younger men. His influence remained, but it was symbolic, like an aging general whose strategies shaped battles long after he left the field. Luciano spent much of his time reflecting on the arc of his life. He understood power in a way few others did. He knew its cost, its fragility, and its temporary nature. The boy from Sicily had become a kingpin in America, reshaped an entire criminal landscape, survived assassination attempts, prison cells, political crusades, and international exile. Yet here he was, alone, far from the world he once ruled. His final act came unexpectedly. On January 26, 1962, Luciano collapsed from a heart attack at the Naples airport after meeting with an American film producer interested in making a movie about his life. It was an almost poetic ending. A man whose existence blurred the line between myth and reality dying during an attempt to tell his own story. He had lived a life larger than most, and even in death, he seemed to exist halfway between the shadows and the spotlight. Authorities combed through his belongings, searching for evidence of ongoing criminal involvement, but found nothing conclusive. Friends and associates mourned him quietly. The criminal world acknowledged him not with fanfare, but with the solemn respect reserved for founding figures, men whose influence shapes generations. Luciano's exile had stripped him of the physical empire he once commanded, but it had not erased his legacy. The modern mafia operated on the structure he created. The commission he designed became the backbone of organized crime for decades. His ideas lived on in every decision, every alliance, every strategic move made long after he was gone. He died far from the streets that made him, but his shadow never left them.